to start with a quote from a Dr. Carolyn Leaf, and she has researched the human brain since 1981. And she said research shows that around 80% of illnesses can be attributed to our thought life and approximately 13% to diet, genetics and environment. And studies conclusively link more chronic diseases, also known as lifestyle diseases, to an epidemic of toxic emotions in our culture. And she wrote that in 2008. And I have found that to be true. It's an estimated about 90% of people who have illnesses, it is stress-related, it can be what's called psychosomatic. So in understanding this, it's going to help us to work with our brain and our body a lot more. We need to work at balancing. And that's part of what I do as a health psychologist, is get people to work on balancing body, mind, brain, the whole lot. Okay, just to start with, there's a great cartoon by Peanuts, and this is, we've got Charlie Brown, and you can see it up on the screen. It says, "This is my depressed stance," and he is standing like this. And then he says, when you're depressed, it makes a lot of difference how you stand, okay? And then he goes on to say, if you stand like this, okay, the worst thing you can do is to straighten up and hold your head high, because then you'll start to feel better. All right? So if you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you've got to stand like this. And if you've watched depressed people, when they walk, when they sit, they stand with their head down or they sit hunched over. And they've actually found physiologically that when you do this, the neurotransmitters and hormones in your brain, when you look down, actually start to drop out. It actually affects the physiology of the brain, okay? But they've also found when you look up, the most amazing thing happens, that your physiology picks up. You'll find you'll have improved neurotransmitter functioning. You'll find that you'll be able to think better, that you'll feel better. So it's a good thing to make sure you're looking up and not looking down. And even if you're a depressed person, if you make the effort to look up, and this is what I get people to do, is work with the body. I get them to look up and not look down. And it makes a huge difference as to how they're feeling. When people learn about that and understand the physiology, I find they put a lot more effort into it. Okay. Now, scientists are now mapping pathways that link emotion to health. And this is a quote from, with a particular research by the name of Herbert Benson back in the 1950s. And he did a lot of work on how we meditate, relax, what happens to the mind. And he, with his co-workers, said the relationship between emotion and health is turning out to be more interesting and more important than most of us could ever have imagined. Viewed through the lens of 21st century science, anxiety, alienation and hopelessness are not just feelings. Neither are love, serenity and optimism. All are physiological states that affect our health just as clearly as obesity or physical fitness. And the brain, as the source of such states, offers a potential gateway to countless other tissues and organs, from the heart and blood vessels to the gut and the immune system. Now, that was a quote from an article in 2006, and even since then we have learnt a lot more about this relationship. So we cannot separate mind and emotions. You cannot separate the body from that process. And unfortunately, this is what often happens, particularly in the medical profession. They tend to look at things in compartments. And I find once you do that, you're not taking into account that relationship. So you cannot just treat the thinking, you cannot just treat the emotions. We have to treat the whole lot. We have to put them into some sort of balance. And I found a couple of really good quotes about our amazing brain. And it says, the human brain is truly the most sophisticated, elegant, biological piece of machinery ever known. You don't have to be a neuroscientist to understand some basic brain science. And this was the opinion of a Dr. Timothy Jennings. He's a psychiatrist in the US, and he's just released a book, The God-Shaped Brain. And this is his work, his life work that he has been doing. And it is so true. We do not need to be a neuroscientist to understand the brain. And they find that the moment you understand something, the brain comes alive. It starts to function. And it's having that light bulb moment. I don't know if you've ever had a light bulb moment. I know I have lots of them at times. And when you have that light bulb moment, it turns the brain on. And then what happens is you have to keep using it, because it is use it or lose it with the brain. So it's such an incredible piece of machinery that we have. Initially, computers were designed from brain function. Okay, we often look at the computers as incredibly smart. I think the first computer was about 8 blocks in length when you looked at it. Nowadays, you get them on microchips. And that does not parallel with the brain. The brain has so much more sophistication and ability to function than a computer. And we think computers are amazing. Well, you have your own computer, and you need to learn to use it, to switch it on. Okay. Here's another quote by Dr. Jennings. He said, "Our brains are constantly in a state of flux. That means our brains are moving and changing the whole time. Moment by moment, new neurons are developing and new circuits are being laid down. Unused connections are removed, dormant nerve tracts are pruned back, and unused neurons are deleted." In other words, it's use it or lose it. The more we use it, and we have to use it in the right way, and that's what this is about. How can you use your brain more efficiently? Okay, so this is known as neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the ability for the brain to rewire itself. And they've done a lot of studies in this area, and they have found, particularly with people who have had a stroke, and they find they've lost their speech centre, they might be immobilised down one side of the body. They have found that when they put them into therapy, that the brain will rewire, because when you have a stroke, it actually cools the tissue in the area. That speech centre is now gone. It does not exist. So when you go to the speech therapist and they get you to start to articulate, it wakes the brain up. Because the brain could already do it, it will actually rewire it in another part of the brain, which I think is an amazing thing. We do have an amazing brain. So we need to be using it, we need to be doing, putting in these networks, and I call them like freeways in the brain. We have amazing freeways, and these networks send information with electrical impulses as well as with the biochemistry, with our brain chemistry. And we're going to look at that a bit more as we go. Another quote by Dr. Jennings says, "Incredibly, our beliefs, thoughts, behaviours, and even our diets change our brain structure, ultimately changing who we are." So that means what we believe, what we behold, is what we become. And that is a biblical principle. It's quite well known that what we look at, and we're asked to look on all those things that are true and lovely and good, because when we do that, that is what the brain becomes. So if we're looking at things that aren't so good, then that's what we become. And unfortunately, this is a sad reality of young people today, or anyone who's spending all their time watching TV, media. They're finding the way the brain is wired is dependent on how we fire it and what we put in. So it's important that we work on making sure we are reading, we are looking at, this is where things like nature is a wonderful uplifting experience, because that is what we're beholding. So this is important. Okay, we're going to have a look at our amazing brain. We were created with an incredible brain, and that has really deteriorated over time, but when you have a look at it, it still is amazing. And most people don't realise we have a brain, but we actually have 3 brains within the brain. Okay, we have a survival brain, and the survival brain is the unconscious brain. It activates the fight or flight response. If we did not have a survival brain, we would die, okay, because if we cannot respond to something, then we cannot function. And if you've ever put your finger on a hot plate, how long does it take you to take it off? Instant. It takes nanoseconds for the brain to register, and this is where we'll look at that process when you touch something hot. Okay? This is your survival brain. It wants to keep you alive. And I find this is when people who are sick and dying, that it's a hard thing. We're born to, or created to actually live, not to die. So that survival brain is constantly scanning and working. And I find with a lot of the people I work with, particularly who've had trauma in their life, they have actually switched the survival brain on and they haven't been able to turn it off. Okay, so this is part of what I do, is help them to stop that activating the survival brain and start to get balance. Because if you've got three brains working and they're not balanced and they're not synchronized, it's not a good place to be. The second brain you have is the emotional brain, and that is the subconscious part of our brain. And that is actually the biggest part. If you take a pumpkin and you put a walnut on top of the pumpkin, the size of the pumpkin is your subconscious emotional brain compared to that little nut, which is how we think. That's our intelligence. So we often think we are intelligent, but it's based on what the emotional brain is doing, what we load into there. Now, the emotional brain stores information in the 5 senses. Okay, so that means we absorb anything we experience with touch, taste, sight, sound, and smell. The most powerful trigger is the smell, because it is actually goes through the brain in a slightly different way, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. But the 5 senses can trigger an emotion. So I don't know if you've ever been somewhere and you go, I don't feel comfortable here, something's wrong. Then you pick up a smell and you go, there's that smell I don't like. But your brain does not go in processing on those 5 senses immediately. You know, and you wonder why you meet someone and you're not comfortable with them. Or you meet someone and you really like them, because often they remind you of, they have certain smells, they have certain presentation, the way they look, that the 5 senses pick up. So the emotional brain is loaded. Now, if you have a trauma of any sort or stress, what loading is that going to be? It's going to be a very traumatic one. And that is where then the emotional brain grows and it loads in too much information, too many issues, problems, stresses, and it does not function well. Okay? It then is constantly triggered and we're in a state of stress. Okay? The third brain we have is your thinking brain. So your thinking brain is the conscious part of you. It's the part of you that can process, that makes sense of things. It's the rational part of our brain. It's where our intelligence lies. Okay? We need the thinking brain. The thinking brain is actually a gateway. And if you've ever, or a gatekeeper, right? So that part of the brain, when we're in an experience, the gatekeeper will actually either open the gate or close the gate. And if it cannot cope with what is happening at the time, if it cannot cope with that input, the conscious mind will shut it down. Right? One, it protects you, because what's happening when it shuts it down is it stops you from going into that stress and trauma. But the problem is the subconscious brain will then load that in, and we now have an embedded trauma or stress that we have to deal with. And what most people do is shut that down. The survival brain now is constantly working. So if we can have those 3 brains working really well together, and here's a diagram showing those 3 brains, okay, if we can work with them and synchronize them, you will find that your whole system will start to balance. So that means you're not loading the negative emotions, you're actually living in the present moment. And I know that's when my brain switched on. I'm in the present, right? When it is compromised, where do I focus? I'm usually focusing in the future, or I'm looking at what's happening back there, ruminating, going over and over. Okay, so we want these 3 brains to work together. The first brain, that survival brain, is often called the reptilian brain because it's not online in the sense that we can think about it, make sense of it. Right? So with your survival brain, if you're not sleeping well, its survival brain is compromised. Then if we don't get enough sleep, it makes it worse. It dictates appetite, it dictates how we protect ourselves. If you're driving down the street, for example, and a car pulls out in front of you, how long does it take you to put your foot on the brakes? Not long at all. What you're going to do is you immediately put the foot on the brake and you go, wow, how did I miss that? You know, I could have been killed. Right? So what we do is we have that survival brain. That's when then the emotions kick in. You find the whole physiology is kicked in. You are revving that engine, and it's your survival brain that has protected you. Okay? What you do with that event afterwards is powerful in how you resolve it, or whether you're going to actually embed it as a trauma memory. And as we go again, we're going to look at this process more fully. But understanding that you have three brains and starting to recognise what brain is taking over. You know, I know some people will intellectualise everything. So what brain are they working with? They're working with their thinking brain. And if we're not careful, we block the emotion or we don't develop the emotional content, and that is important. Okay. Here's a view of our amazing brain, and it's showing you the different areas of the brain. Okay, so we have two areas here. We have your right brain and your left brain, and that makes up what's called the neocortex. The neocortex is that part of the brain that is online. It can connect with things, it thinks, it processes, it thinks rationally. But the neocortex, the left and right brain, have two functions. Okay, your right brain is a window into the emotional brain. So even though the emotional brain is actually in the centre of our brain, and we're going to again look at that in more detail afterwards, but at the moment it's just understanding that when your right brain is active and you're hypervigilant, you're accessing emotion. You are not thinking, okay? Then if you think too much and you are turning on the thinking brain, what you're going to do is you're going to block the emotion. So this is where we have no balance. Okay, so we want to balance left and right brain. When you are functioning too much on your right brain, you're hypervigilant. Say we come back to that car near miss where you thought you might have been going to die and you've activated a lot of that fight-flight response. Your emotional brain, if it stays online, it's going to be hypervigilant. You're going to be driving around waiting for someone to jump out at you again and overreacting. But if you balance that back again, and we're going to look at some tools as we go to do that, then what happens is your thinking brain will balance it and you'll get off of that hypervigilance. Now, a lot of disorders I work with are really right brain disorders. For example, someone who has anxiety, panic attacks, can't cope with life, is hypervigilant. They are the people that are working on right brain. It's a bit like working a muscle. And if you work one muscle too much, what happens? It grows at the expense of the other. So this is where opening of the right brain and storing it into the emotional brain and working on that is not nice. Those are people who don't like going to supermarkets, who have panic attacks, and we all suffer from anxiety at times. It's a normal response. The brain is actually wired with some primary emotions, which include anxiety, anger, fear. Now you go, why would we have these? Because that's connected to the survival brain. The survival brain works on the fear and it loads it into your emotional brain. So we need that connection. Now with your prefrontal cortex, which is that left and right brain, once you work with it, it's got a binocular effect, which is interesting. And what happens with the right and left brain, they process differently. Your right brain will actually go from bigger picture to smaller parts, and your left brain works the other way, smaller parts to bigger picture. And one of the best things you can do to help the brain to balance is to do jigsaw puzzles or do something that is getting the brain going. And what happens when you do a jigsaw puzzle? You get the puzzle, you look at the big picture, you tip out the pieces, then you start going through all your pieces, and what you do is you start putting it together, mapping it. You go back to the bigger picture, then to the smaller parts. That will balance it. But if you get someone who is anxious, for example, what's their bigger picture? If they're going to the supermarket and they're worried about it or they're anxious about it, all they're seeing is what's going to happen there. They won't cope, they're going to have anxiety, people will notice, so they start to go into fear. And when they do that, they're feeding that right brain and they're setting themselves up then for that hypervigilance. But bringing the thinking brain back online means you go from bigger picture back to smaller parts, and the left brain is going to then look at the smaller parts. And that's the part we go, well, hang on, if I go to the supermarket and that's happening, I can walk outside, do some breathing, calm down and go back in. Okay, just like with the jigsaw puzzle, you've got the two dynamics working. So what I help people do is get them to work with that binocular effect. And when you work in the present moment, I find what happens, you're actually working left-right brain. Okay. One of the things that happens when you're working your left brain too much. You get very caught in ruminating, right? So the left brain function is the thinking brain. And what it will do, it will go over and over and over things. And when you go over the past, what can happen? It's not very nice. You're going to get very depressed. So this is where we can get stuck on either side of the brain function. Okay. Between your left and right brain, we have connections, and interestingly, males have a more dominant connection between left and right brain. Okay, so they tend to think more from across something, they problem solve, they don't do multiples, whereas women work in multiples. A woman will have 6 things happening at once and they'll be working back and forth in the brain. They actually have a lot of wiring. Now, both have advantages and disadvantages. I know the male brain can get stuck in the box and the female brain can get overloaded. So it's not about one is better than the other. We've been created with a brain that differs. The male-female brain differs. The male brain is larger, and full development is about mid-20s for the male. Females' full development, growing development of the brain is about 23. So what is happening for the male, they have a bigger brain with less wiring, it's not as complex, whereas females have a smaller brain with much more intense wiring. And that wiring works from about 12 amps of electricity that runs through the brain, as well as that biochemical messengers that form those pathways. Okay, so we do have an incredible brain. Understanding it certainly makes a difference. Now, we also have a slide up at the moment that is looking at the limbic system. The limbic system is your emotional brain. That is that second brain. It's actually in the centre core, and it works through that right brain functioning. And in looking at that diagram, there's got what is called, you've probably heard of the corpus callosum, which is the nerve bundle that runs from here to the back of the brain. Now, with the corpus callosum, it is the part that connects the brain, but in that area there is where we have the will. Okay, that's where our free will resides. It's the part of us that makes decisions, and if it's compromised, we can't make a good decision. Okay. The other thing with that part of the brain, right at the front of the cortex, just behind that front area, is where the conscience lies. Okay, now you've all heard of that, and you often get told, I've got a good conscience or a bad conscience. Okay, or listen to your conscience. Some people refer to it as that little voice that they hear. And it is this part that connects us to knowing what is right and wrong. Okay, they found now in research that there are people who are born without a conscience. Isn't that interesting? And they found that someone who is born without the conscience does not know right and wrong. And they often have high IQ, they're very charming people, but they have no remorse, right? And you've probably seen at times in the paper where a magistrate or a judge has said, that's it, we have to lock them up. We can never release that person because they have no remorse. And they're actually found in research that it is a birth defect. And it's very scary because that person can be very dangerous. And this is what we find in our society. But for the majority of us, you know, these are a minority group, the majority have a conscience. But you can shut down, you can deactivate that part of the brain. Okay, so this is where, again, our spiritual functioning is important because we want to be receptive to right and wrong. We want to be able to use our will to action what we know is right and true. Okay. Now, the other thing about the brain, when we take in information, particularly into this limbic system, into the emotional brain, it will program it, whether it's truth, lies, fact, or fiction. That part of the brain, it takes it all in, and it does not judge, it does not discern. It doesn't go, oh, that's not very nice. It doesn't think that way. It's our thinking brain that has to work with this limbic system to correct it. Okay? There are a couple of areas in the brain that are important that would be helpful for you to know. One of them is, and you'll see on our diagram there, it's called the amygdala. And the amygdala, or one researcher shortened it to Amy so you can remember it, is a little almond-shaped part of the limbic system that stores emotional memory in the 5 senses. Okay? So this is one part of the brain that is what we call neuroplastic. Now, the neuroplasticity means the brain is like plasticine. You can mould it, you can develop it, you can grow it, you can change it. So it's this part of the brain. There are several parts, but that's one of them. So our emotional brain can grow, and some people have a lot of information in there, particularly if you're a very hypersensitive person and you have a lot of fear and trauma. The amygdala will probably be fairly large in that individual. Okay, and we access, when the survival brain kicks in, it is that emotional access it uses from the amygdala. So that's when the fear, what we call the fear circuitry, and we all have a fear circuitry, and if we didn't, we would not survive. The other part of the brain that you'll see there that's important, and this is now, it's underneath the limbic system, it's called the hippocampus. And one researcher referred to it as hippo, so people could remember. He likes to be a bit more user-friendly. So the hippocampus is a flat disc lying just underneath your emotional brain or limbic system. And what that does, it actually stores memory. So any visual memory you have, any memory you have that is connected to events in your life, it stores it in there. Okay? And interestingly with that again is a neuroplastic area. So neuroplasticity means that area can grow and change. When you exercise, when you are out in nature, and they found things like when we have spiritual practices, when we pray, when we worship, when we have fun, when we socialise, that part of the brain produces trillions of brain cells because your brain is highly connected. It constantly is producing. Okay, unless we want to change it. So those brain cells that are available are very powerful in you being able to use your brain and to develop memory networks, okay, and preferably the right memory networks. And they've found, for example, and they've done this with school children where they get them exercising, say half an hour before school. They've done it in studies with people in employment, and what they do is they get them to have a stretching exercise program half an hour before. They have found because it produces so many brain cells, they have more available for the day's work. They find that they function better, there's less absenteeism, they enjoy what they do a lot more. So this is where we're now starting to look at the impact of how our brain develops and how things we do can grow and change our brain. Okay. It is a use it or lose it principle. Okay. The other thing they found that is very interesting in studies is with this hippocampus is that people who have Alzheimer's disease, they have found a number of people that have not actually suffered from it. They have not lost their memory. They have symptoms of Alzheimer's, they're diagnosed with it, but they do not lose the memory. When they have done autopsies on these brains, they have found that what happens is that person had so many brain cells to start with. They had grown the hippocampus. It was still fairly thick, and they therefore, when they started to lose the memory function with Alzheimer's, they had plenty of cells there and could still use their memory. Okay, so isn't this a good message for us? You know, the more we use the brain, the more we exercise it, the more we look after it, and we're going to look at more things we can do to look after your brain, the better it functions. Okay, so one, we want brain balance, and we want to have a healthy brain that is working well. Now, there was an interesting interview. I found another specialist in this area, Dr. Andrew Newberg, and he has done lots of studies on the brain and brain function. He's a medical person, he uses the imaging machines, and he can have a look at what's going on with the brain. He's a Christian and he's also a scientist, and he works with a concept he calls faith in the brain. And according to this article, it says Dr. Newberg reports that meditation improves memory and reduces stress, and that the kind of God you worship can affect the structure of your brain. Now, isn't that amazing? This isn't just hearsay. This is done from scientific research that shows these things that can happen to us. So he says we've learned that being religious or spiritual has a very profound effect on who we are, has a very profound effect on our biology and our brain. It actually can change our brain and change ourselves over time. Okay, so if you want to change, having a meditation time is very powerful. Okay, and I've been told at least having an hour a day where you can spend time doing these sorts of things, where you can be more reflective, is conducive to health. It does not have to be in one whole hour. It can be 10 minutes, 15 minutes here and there, but having that time where we let the brain settle, where we actually focus the brain more externally. Okay, so this Andrew Newberg also found that when we focus our brain on a God of love, okay, so when we see the brain functioning from love, when we meditate on that, he found it actually improved memory, the brain was growing, that we actually had engaged the empathy, compassion, altruism, and we also had a lot more sympathy. So this is purely because we have a concept and we've taken time to meditate on what we see as a God of love. This is why I love nature and creation, because it's so easy to be out there and to actually meditate in that space. And meditation is an active thing. It's not, some of the concepts are that we actually empty the brain. We don't. We're focusing the brain. We're focusing out of self. And unfortunately, we are born in a very self-centered state. Right? We are born in self-centeredness in that we have to learn to focus out. And that's not always easy. And I'm sure you can recall or know a lot of people who are self-centered. So one of the things you have to start looking at in yourself is, how self-centered am I? You know, do I actually spend too much time looking at me and worrying about me and focusing on me? Because you need to start to focus out, and that's what meditating out on a God of love will do. And there have been a lot of studies, it's not just this one. You know, they find people who have an active faith live 6 years longer than someone who does not. Okay, so what does that mean? It means our brain and our body is actioning in faith. It's actioning outside. It's not just being self-centered. Okay, we are growing the brain. The other thing he said then, if we focus our meditation on something that is in the environment or something that is more of a God of control, right? And I look nowadays, you have a look at who are all the gods we have around us. When you have a look at sports, you have a look at the things that we worship, you know, the things that we do, money or whatever becomes your God, and it's a controlling God, then they find it actually shrinks the brain, memory does not improve, it actually declines, and they find then that they actually seem to develop this fear circuitry that if it continues will actually cause incredible inflammation in the system. Now, one of the things I found, we have a lot of what we call inflammatory disorders today. We have disorders that are caused not by genetics necessarily, it's caused by the stress that we are under. And when you have a look at the world and where it's headed, it is a pretty scary place at times. You know, I don't watch the news a lot because I just find it's too triggering. You know, I find people will tell you what's going on if you don't watch the news. You find out the reality. But I find those visual images and what we do that go into the brain are very powerful. Okay. Another thing, coming back to the brain and looking at the emotional brain particularly, when we are born, even pre-birth, the brain develops, it's the right brain that's developing, it's your emotional brain. The thinking brain does not develop until around 2 years of age. Okay, so that means we are functioning predominantly or totally on emotions. A baby is an emotional being, and a lot of the brain development that goes back up until about 2 is crucial in how we have relationships, on how secure we feel, and how we will function through life. Okay. The 2-year mark is when your thinking brain, that left side of the brain, starts to develop. Okay, so we do not have the ability to think. A baby cannot lie crying in their crib because they're wet and they want to be changed or they're hungry and think, oh, well, mum's probably busy, it's okay. They can't do that. They respond. Well, we're born self-centered for a start, so we just have to get our needs met. They find that if a parent does not acknowledge the child, that if the parent misses the cue that the child is distressed, and they go, oh no, the child will be fine, they'll just cry themselves to sleep, what they actually do is go into a state of trauma and they cry themselves out and they just shut down. The brain actually shuts down. Okay. Now, if the mother recognises it and comes back and then acknowledges it and corrects it, the baby's brain will pick up again. Okay. So it's not about one-off things in childhood. It is about the overall thing that parents do. If you have a parent who is depressed, anxious, not present, in fear, in an abusive relationship, that child will not get their emotional needs met. They will not feel secure. And if you're not securely attached by about the age of 2, and that means that the emotional brain feels secure at the majority of times, that it's a happy child who is connected. And the biggest connection is with mum or your primary caregiver. So the child actually sees itself as physically attached to mum until that 2-year mark, around 2, when the thinking brain develops. Okay. When the thinking brain develops, then the child starts to think, and it's usually in very black and white terms. For example, a child who is starting to think and mum hides or dad hides behind the door, the child will think the person's left the room, that the mum's left the room or dad's left the room. They'll get very distressed because their brain cannot process between they're there or they're not there. Okay, so this is where we have to help that developmental process. Okay, a crucial time of that development is usually in the feeding process. So whoever is the primary feeder for that child, if they get securely connected where the feeder, the mother or whoever feeds them is composed, is connected, is there for that child, that will bring about ultimate security. Okay. If the parent is not, say for example, the parent has a lot of anger and pain and they come to feed the child and they've got that anger, the child then perceives the world as an angry place, right? If the carer is disconnected, they distance themselves, they see the world as a disconnected place. Okay. Now you go, well, what hope is there? The good news is that the brain can change and grow. Right? Our developmental beliefs are in that crucial 2-year period. That is where we put in our beliefs about relationships, about values, whether they be social, spiritual, parental values, family values, just general peer values. They go in at that point and are embedded. And we cannot go, well, I can remember when I was 12 months old and Dad yelled at me. We can't remember that. So what we do further in life as we grow up, if that was a problem for us, if someone starts yelling, we're reacting like we're still back at 18 months of age. It triggers that emotional brain. Okay. With our emotions then, we can use them as a guiding part of us to know whether we're feeling secure or we're feeling fearful and to do something about it. So this is where when you do that, you rewire the brain. If you pick up on a belief that you realise isn't working for you, you will find that what will happen is you can correct the belief. You rewire out, even if that belief is pre-2. Okay? Personality development that is part of the brain structure also develops at around 2 years of age, and that is where we have what they call the terrible twos. Okay, so that is where the brain is trying to find its place in life. It's testing the boundaries, and if we don't deal with that or the child's insecure, the personality develops in a very imbalanced way. So that means they now have mental, emotional imbalances in the brain, and the body is following that. So it's important, security is an important thing. I find when I'm working with people, if one, I give them hope that they can get well is important because the brain will wake up and go, oh, I can get well. The other one is going to be if I help them feel secure and safe. Safety is a huge factor, okay? So this is important. I will say that the majority of people that we meet will have certain insecurities, will have compromised brain development because life is not perfect. Nothing is perfect. We also have the genetic coding that can be activated. Okay, so when we have a look at the brain and look at everything, it is important that we understand we have a brain that is multifaceted. We have a brain that has more than one component we need to synchronize and we need to balance. That we've already programmed that brain, and that programming might not be good for us, that we might have to change some of it. Most people hate change, unfortunately, but that is what we have to do. So part of it is challenging yourself to make that change. Stepping back and being a little bit more aware of how your body functions, what you're doing with it, and how you are using it. Okay? Because that bit of care and that bit of insight is going to make a difference to your general well-being. You want to start ferreting out those beliefs that aren't working well for you. You know, an example of that, I had someone who was talking to me about a belief they had, because we were talking about changing beliefs. And when she was very little, she would go to the local fairs and things, and they had what's called fairy floss. Okay, and she used to really enjoy fairy floss. One day she's driving down the road with her husband. She was in her 30s, and she said to her husband, she said, "Oh, there's a fairy floss tree." And he looked at her and said, "What do you mean?" And she saw this tree with all these fluffy flowers and that. She said, "It's a fairy floss tree." He said, "Who told you that?" He said, "There's no fairy floss trees." And she said, "My father, I asked him where fairy floss came from, and he told me it grew on trees." So you can see how powerful what we are told is. She laughed. It was a harmless belief. It didn't really matter. But what if we have a belief that does matter? Okay. This is what we have to change. This is what we have to look at. So the challenge for you in this program and listening to this is to change your brain. Okay? It will change, I guarantee. When you finish watching this series and listening to this information, your brain will have changed. You will not be the same person. Okay? And what you take from it is powerful in how you are going to use it and how well you're going to change that brain. You do not have to wait forever. You know, and I find people who feel hopeless and say, "I've been like this for how long's my life been?" I go, "Well, it won't take you forever. The moment you start, the moment the change occurs, you don't have to do another 50 years if you're 50 years old. You can actually rewire your brain very, very rapidly. The more you do it, the more powerful it becomes. The more the brain integrates and understands, the more it perceives and picks things up. Okay? The senses we're talking about, we start to use them. The aim is to have your brain switched on in the present moment, to be able to perceive what is around you and to be able to enjoy it, to make sense of it, and to use that information or that experience. Okay? One of the indicators, if you're not happy in the moment, is your brain is not working well. So I get people to start to look at, where is my brain? Am I worrying about this? Am I ruminating on that? And working with smartening the brain up. Getting you to do exercises. It's what we call neuropic exercises are going to really help the brain. There's a very good little book I found called Keep Your Brain Alive with 83 neuropic exercises. And one of the things that they suggested is that in the morning when you wake up, get a fragrance of some sort and smell, and it wakes the brain up. Right? So, and if you get something like peppermint, it perks the brain up. If you get something like lavender, it's going to calm it down, okay? Because that's how the brain responds. So it challenges you to use it or lose it, okay? Think of all the things you can do a bit differently. The other thing they suggested is, why don't you try brushing your teeth with your left hand if you're right-handed? Okay, that's a challenge. I tried that one. I'm still working on it. But what it's doing, it's challenging the circuitry in your brain to start to balance. It's switching on left and right brain. Okay, if you don't do puzzles and things, sometimes do those things. You know, find things that help you to be in the present moment and work with the amazing brain that you have. You know, the more you work with it, the more you grow it. And the more powerfully you grow it, the better you become as an individual, your functionality, your ability to remember, to retain information. Okay, how often do you block information? How often do you go, "What's their name?" Okay, so what have you done? You've just used that thinking gatekeeper, and you're trying so hard, it's put a gate up, it hasn't opened the gate. What we want to do is open the gate. The moment you relax, you remember the name. So this is where, when we're more relaxed, we're going to be able to recall things, use things, and work smart. Okay, so see how you can get your brain to work smart throughout these sessions.